Some Bible scholars practice what we call deconstruction criticism, an attempt sometimes to dismantle texts and then reconfigure them in ways that produce meanings the original author couldn't possibly have intended for the readers to create or to see within the texts. I don't think we should be so much deconstructing texts as at least occasionally considering deconstructing inherited interpretations of those texts. Sometimes we're so sure we know what texts mean, and in particular the most well-known of the texts, that it's almost impossible to imagine any other way to read it. But then we run the risk of actually missing what original authors might well have wanted to communicate. I want to illustrate that with an exceedingly well-known text. In fact, my interpretation of that text is becoming more and more well-known as well. It's been published in my book, Double Take. I've presented it in lots of places. So if this isn't the first place that you're encountering this, well, I apologize for the repetition. But it bears careful consideration. Maybe the most well-known texts have to be looked at all over again. So this I'm calling Enriching Our Christmas Traditions. Now, if you look at the scenery behind me, it's obviously not Christmas time, it's springtime. But then maybe one of the ways of rethinking the Christmas story is to imagine Jesus having been born not on a snowy December 24th or 25th, but in spring, or summer, or fall, we don't know. But we have traditions, and maybe it's time to reconsider some of them. So here goes. Christmas. It's a time where traditions become important. We sing traditional Christmas songs. We enjoy the family traditions that we've inherited from our childhood or developed in our own families. And we retell the old Christmas story that never changes. We read the story, perhaps we recite it, or maybe, as in our family, we act it out. We relive with Mary and Joseph the long, grueling trip to Bethlehem that was just a bit too much for a 9-month pregnant woman and led to a short labor and delivery on the night of their arrival in Bethlehem. We respond with astonishment once more that the arriving king is not born in a palace, not even in a house or in a hotel room, but in a barn, and that his first bed is a feeding trough. We hear the angel's message, we run with the shepherds, we ponder with Mary. In short, we relive that old story that never changes. And then we try to make those traditions come alive as we supplement them with traditions of our own. Traditions about trees and gifts and guests and Christmas dinners and lots of things designed to make Christmas special, but often, in fact, turning it into a dizzying cycle of busy activity and stressed nerves. Right. Perhaps we've also developed some traditions that don't enrich our Christmas celebrating. I think about some of those as I reflect on Christmases past. Do you remember your last year's celebration? I don't know how yours was, but if you'll let me be just a little tongue-in-cheek, let me describe a typical one. For months, we think about it, we worry about it, we plan for it, we save for it. Then around the beginning of December, visible evidences of the coming Christmas season begin to appear. Or was that in November? Or was that already in October? Huge advertisements showing up in the malls, decorations mounted on light poles, hubbies complaining that they have to risk their lives on the stepladder again as they mount their lights on the rain gutters. Maybe their wives could do it this year. Equality should cut both ways, shouldn't it? And so our nerves get stressed. Christmas trees are sold all over the city and soon appear in living rooms, all dressed up with tinsel and lights and ornaments. And then it's surely time to start buying gifts. And the great Christmas competition begins. Competition, who can find parking spots for their cars, who can squeeze into the already crowded stores, who can sneak a few spaces forward in the checkout lines. Competition, which stores will sell the most, which parents will buy the most, which kids will get the most. People stock up on candies and nuts and turkey. Countless hours are spent cooking and baking and working overtime to pay for it all. And as the great day gets closer, the pace quickens. People get more tense and touchy. Mom complains about all the banquets she has to prepare. Dad complains about the family gatherings getting so huge and expensive. Kids complain if they're not allowed to open their gifts on the 23rd already. People travel hundreds of miles to fulfill obligations to their families. And when it's all over, they come home late and tired and grumpy. They probably overate on Christmas turkey, maybe overdrank on Christmas cheer. Christmas comes with a big splash, and if we're not careful, it washes out our best laid plans for a nice, quiet, meaningful Christmas. And then come the after Christmas blues, exchanging all those gifts that are of little value or didn't fit, taking down the direct decorations, cleaning up the tree, not to mention cleaning up all the new toys that are lying around, some of them already broken on the living room floor. Slowly Christmas fades away and everyone breathes a sigh of relief. That was Christmas. Well, maybe not quite, but maybe it's not all that far off either. So what can we do? Well, I have two proposals. I need to present the second because I don't think you're going to like the first. My first proposal: we could just boycott Christmas. Just not do all those things that make the season so hectic and often so empty. We could live without a tree, couldn't we? After all, there wasn't a decorated tree in the stable, was there? And we could do without all those banquets and feasts. After all, the shepherds were probably eating barley bread and maybe some dried fish on the hillside. And gifts. Well, if necessary, maybe a few quick gift certificates, pass them around. That should take care of it. And who needs Christmas cards? And do we really need to visit our relatives again so soon? Well, you're probably skeptical about my first proposal, so I have a second one. Actually, I think if things are going to be different, the difference will have to be more on the inside than on all the trimmings. A meaningful Christmas will depend far more on our inner attitude than on all the external events that mark the season. So my proposal, I suppose, is a bit radical, but I want us to maybe re-examine Luke's account and then reimagine what actually took place on that first Christian Christmas night. Now, I don't mean invent a new story. I mean, take the Bible very seriously, but read it differently and then fill in the gaps differently than we're accustomed to doing. Or have you never noticed how much of the Christmas story we actually make up with our imaginations? Like, how many magi were there? Who knows? The Bible doesn't tell us, so we just make it 3. Standardize it. You got to have the right number of figures for your Christmas display. And let's just make them all men, even though the text doesn't say any of that. And which animals were there in the stable? Who knows? The Bible doesn't tell us. So we just make it an ox and a donkey. Well, our Christmas songs fill in the gaps for us. Ox and ass before him bow, and he is in the manger now. Oh yes, I forgot about the shepherd boy playing his drum and carrying the lamb. I don't know how he ever did that, but you see, we just fill in the animals. But the Bible doesn't tell us. And of course, we use great imagination with the evil innkeeper. You see, he's the bad guy in the story. Whole Sunday school plays have been presented. I remember one from my childhood. We centered on his opportunism, taking advantage of market conditions to quadruple his rates. We focused on his callous blindness, didn't even recognize the coming of the Lord of glory, on his hard-heartedness, couldn't even find room for an expecting couple, and his economic chauvinism. Poor carpenters just couldn't cut it. You had to be a Roman census official or a respected Jewish leader to find a room in his hotel on that busy night. And so on, and so on. We just fill in the details of the story. We use our imaginations to round out the bare details that Luke and Matthew supply. In fact, when we use our imaginations, we often imagine it in a way that we ourselves are convinced it didn't happen. Well, the Bible says that the wise men came to the house, but the shepherds went to the manger. But you see, it just fits so much better if we put them all together under the tree. And even though most people are convinced that the wise men came quite a bit later, well, we just put the star somewhere up there to shine down on the manger scene on the very first Christmas night, rather than on the house, the way Matthew says it happened. And having created our images of Bethlehem, now we let the story challenge us. Challenge us to be peaceful and calm like the shepherds on the hillside, to be filled with worship and praise like the angels, to be as generous as the Magi, as contemplative as Mary, as obedient as Joseph. It's a beautiful story, this one that we've filled in for ourselves. No matter how probable or improbable some of our imaginations are, well, mostly beautiful. There is still that old evil innkeeper. But we kind of need him as our scapegoat. After all, the other characters are so larger than life, they leave us with an impossible ideal. But one thing does comfort us. We're not as bad as the evil innkeeper. We would have found room somehow. Now, I suggested before that we reimagine the Christmas story. Just imagine it having taken place differently than we usually do. And I want to suggest a way of retelling that story. I begin with the question, how did the innkeeper get into our story? Well, we get the idea of an innkeeper from the mention of the inn. After all, the story says there was no room for them in the inn, doesn't it? And if there was no room in the inn, that means some innkeeper didn't make room in his inn. But the story in Luke doesn't actually refer to an inn either. Not in the original language, at least. Now, maybe you think I'm just making this up. Well, no, I'm actually going to pass on the blame really quickly here so that you don't think that I'm a heretic. I encountered this article, first of all, in about 1988. There's actually a little notification right there in the corner that says, this article came to us too late to spoil Christmas sermons in 1987. But we didn't want to wait a year before sharing it with you. This is Kenneth Bailey, who wrote an article, The Manger and the Inn. It's a shorter version of one that came out a little earlier than that. But Kenneth Bailey's work opened my eyes to see some new things that I had never noticed before. First of all, that there is no inn in the story. Well, at least the word that Luke uses doesn't usually mean inn. It's a word that could mean inn. It's the word kataluma. But it doesn't usually mean inn. It means guest room. So this word kataluma, how do we know what it means? Well, we check where else it's used in Scripture. It's actually used exactly 3 times. Once here in Luke chapter 2, where no definition of it is given. But in the 2 other places, we're told exactly what the word means. It shows up in Luke 22 and in Mark 14. In both of those cases, it refers to the room in which Jesus had his Last Supper with the disciples. And they didn't go to an inn. In fact, Luke himself clearly describes this kataluma in Luke 22 as a large upper room. That is to say, it's a guest room built on the top of a normal house. A small house would typically have a small kataluma on the roof. A large house would have one big enough for a banquet for 13 people, for example. And it was typically called the kataluma. So if the word clearly means a guest room at the top of a house in 2 of the 3 places where it shows up in the Bible, it's pretty probable that it means exactly the same thing in Luke chapter 2. Now, Kenneth Bailey doesn't leave it to chance. He checks it the other way around. What word would Luke have used if he wanted to refer to an inn, a commercial establishment where people can spend the night? Well, we don't have to guess, because in fact, in Luke's gospel, he does talk about precisely such an inn, but he uses a different word. Do you remember where he uses that? It's in the parable of the Good Samaritan. The Good Samaritan takes the injured man to an inn. He doesn't take him to the guest room in a house that would have been called a kataluma. He takes him to an inn, and Luke calls it the pandecheion. In fact, he even refers to the innkeeper in that story and names him with the corresponding title, a pandechius. That's someone who works in a pandecheion. So what does all this mean for our understanding of the Christmas story? Well, taking into account the way Luke uses these words, kataluma, pandecheion, it's really likely that Luke's Christmas story actually says they laid him in a manger because there was no guest room available for them. By the way, check out modern translations. That's precisely what's showing up. First in the footnotes, and now more and more in the main text. So Jesus, the baby, was laid in a manger because the guest room at the top of the house was already occupied by other guests. Now, I imagine you might be saying, inn, guest room, who cares which it is? They're both places to sleep, and who cares if Joseph and Mary had to go to the barn because the inn was full or because the guest room was full? They still had to go to the barn, and it all comes out exactly the same. Well, here's where everything gets interesting. With a closer reading of the text, there's actually more that disappears from it than just the inn, and of course, with it, the evil innkeeper. There's no stable in the story either. Well, check your Bibles. There's no mention of a stable anywhere in the Christmas story. But, we protest, there must have been a stable. There was a manger, and a manger means a stable. Not necessarily. Kenneth Bailey points out that there's evidence all over the Old and New Testament that a typical first-century Palestinian manger would not be found in a stable, that is, in a separate building made for animals. It would be found in the living room of a family's one-room, split-level house. The typical Palestinian peasant's house would have one large room under a flat roof, but built on 2 different levels, an upper level where the family lived and ate and slept, and a lower level where the animals would normally spend the night. I have a sketch. And then, of course, let me see how I can do this. 2 levels. Upper level for the family, lower level for the animals, and then the manger built into the living room. And then, of course, there might be a guest room on the roof. So where was the manger? Well, it was in the most logical place that you could build it, into the floor of the living area right next to the lower level where the animals were kept. That way, animals could stand on their lower level and eat hay from the manger built into the floor of the higher level. A typical manger was in the living room of a typical house. What does that do to the Christmas story? Well, now not only the innkeeper and his inn disappear, but the stable is gone. When Luke says they wrapped the baby in strips of cloth and laid him in a manger because there was no room for them in the kataluma, he's not saying they had to go to the barn because the innkeeper was too hard-hearted to make a room available for the holy couple. Rather, it's saying they were taken right into the living room because the guest room was already full. The entire narrative, it's not about a full hotel, an evil innkeeper, and a cold, dark barn. It's about a typical Palestinian house, one that did have room for the holy couple, even though the guest room was already occupied with other friends or relatives crowding into Bethlehem for the census. Now, if this way of reading the text is correct, what do we gain and what do we lose? Well, this way of reading the text actually saves us a great deal of trouble, and it actually makes a lot more sense of what we read in the Bible. Now we don't have to imagine that Jesus was born on the very night that Mary and Joseph arrived in Bethlehem. The way Luke tells the story, it sounds rather as though she spent the last weeks or even months of her pregnancy there. While they were there, the time came for the baby to be born. And we don't have to wonder how Mary, who has relatives in the hill country of Judea, and Joseph, who's a native son of the village, how these people can't find a single family, let alone one of their many relatives, who are going to take them in for the night or for a week or perhaps for the last months of Mary's pregnancy. You see, we've had to imagine Mary and Joseph arriving at night, the very night of Jesus' birth, because that's the only way we can explain why they couldn't find a decent place to sleep. But with this new reading, we have a ready answer. They're staying with relatives and friends whose house is already full, but they make room for the couple anyway. Best of all, we don't have to invent a brand new house that the family moved into after Jesus' birth, but before the wise men arrive. After all, the shepherds came to a manger, the wise men went to a house. Guess they must have moved in the meantime, the way we usually read the story. But with this new reading, well, they're in the same house all along, which means we actually have no trouble believing that the wise men and the shepherds gathered together to worship Jesus. Rich and poor, Jew and Gentile, gathering together to worship the one born to be king. And now we can even imagine that the star leading the wise men to the place Jesus lay shone over the house, not months later, but on the very first Christmas night. And so, instead of reimagining a story in such a way that we have to throw away all our manger scenes, we actually find a way to read it that makes appropriate even those parts that we didn't think represented what actually happened. After all, there was still a manger, and there were probably animals, and we could argue with Kenneth Bailey a little and say, of course, there was a stable, even if it's part of the house. So we get to keep our manger scenes and let the star shine on the shepherds and the wise men. There's only one thing that we lose, and that's our evil innkeeper, our scapegoat. But then maybe we can find better motivations for a meaningful Christmas than just staying a couple of steps ahead of that old Scrooge. In my opinion, this way of reading Luke 2 gives us far more than it takes from us. We may lose our scapegoat, the evil innkeeper, but we gain a wonderful picture of what it really meant for Jesus to come down from glory to join humanity. A picture of God coming down to identify with common folk like you and me, coming right down where we are, being born in a normal home like all the other babies in Bethlehem. There were probably any number of other babies enjoying the soft hay in mangers in the living rooms of other crowded homes in Bethlehem during that crowded year of the census. So finally, what does this say about our celebrating of Christmas? Well, I referred at the beginning to that old story that never changes. Well, its essence doesn't change, but a little creative imagination might change some of the ways that we think about it, and thus also celebrate it. If our Christmas celebrating is going to be meaningful, it'll mostly be because of what happens on the inside as we celebrate the season. And I think this new reading of the text suggests a whole new internal motivation and spiritual resource for celebrating Christmas differently. It challenges us to open up our living rooms for Jesus. Making room for Jesus not out in the barn, not in an inn, but in our living rooms, right there where the family lives, where the pets roam, where we work and sleep and play and eat, even when our homes are packed full of guests. If a home in Bethlehem could make room for Jesus in the hustle and the bustle of census time, we can do it in the hustle and the bustle of the Christmas season. So next time Christmas rolls around, I don't want to imagine Jesus lying out there in the barn somewhere while we prepare our Christmas celebrations in the warm house. I don't want to limit the worship part of Christmas to a few reverent trips out there to the stable. Once or twice for church services, maybe a family Bible reading on Christmas Eve, or Christmas morning when we open gifts. Rather, I want to imagine Jesus in our living room right through the season. In fact, I want to imagine him going shopping with me, helping me to be kind to the people in the stores. I want to imagine him helping me choose appropriate gifts for the people I love. I want to imagine him joining me in the kitchen as I prepare my part of our family meal. I want to imagine Jesus present, not out there in the barn. After all, they called him Emmanuel, God with us. With us, not only on Christmas Eve or Christmas morning, but all through the hustle and the bustle of the season. Seen with new eyes, Luke's Christmas account can bring the season a new significance and a meaning and a depth that gifts and decorations and festivities can't deliver.